Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, welcome to you from wherever you're dialing in from in the world. Welcome to Lunch and Learn session at Team Consulting. My name's Chris Hurlstone and I'll be talking about 5 nines reliability and how to achieve it. By way of introduction, this is all to do with the FDA draft guidance on reliability for emergency use injectors. That's been in place since April 2020. That followed on from various correspondence with manufacturers on this subject over a number of years. True to say, regulatory guidance is very helpful, especially in areas of industry uncertainty. Also true to say, I think that this guidance is challenging in a number of ways. So the point of this presentation is just to highlight some of the challenges that we've come across in our workings in this area and to suggest some possible approaches to overcome them. Wherever you see this kind of blue font in the presentation, that's an extract directly from the guidance. Here are a few to kind of kick things off. So acknowledgement that it's an iterative process and that the specification is based on knowledge of the design, the manufacture and use of the product. The key line here is this level that is required, 5 nines at 95% level of confidence. And a recognition, it's a balance between the necessarily low level of user risk for these kind of products, their emergency use, they need to work first time, but also recognition that we need to get products on the market to avoid drug shortages or delayed product availability. And there's also lines stating that you can use an alternative approach if it satisfies the requirements and applicable statutes and regulations. Some of you may have done that. If you have, I would be very interested to hear about them. One thing to say, there's a lot of talk about the fault tree analysis aspect of this guidance. It's not all about the fault tree analysis. It's clear in the guidance that reliability should include traditional development activities, design control activities, manufacturing controls, etc. And also the guidance assumes compliance with, in particular, these 21 CFR regulations, including design controls. So the reliability guidance is on top of these other regulations that need to be applied. How demanding is it? Answer, I think pretty demanding. So for fault tree, the probabilities are based on Boolean logic. So failure frequencies for AND gates are multiplied and for OR gates are added. So to achieve the required failure frequency effectively for the main fault, the sum of all of the failure modes connected by OR gates must be less than the required value. So just an illustration here, if you have failure frequencies down at some of the root causes, you need to sum those up, potentially multiply them, and all of that number as you add it together needs to come out to, in this case, less than 0.00001. As a comparison with 11608, for dose accuracy, the reliability is 97.5% at 95% confidence, which effectively comes out at 0.025. So 5 nines is much more stringent. So what I really want to talk about today is elements that should make up a strategy for trying to achieve 5 nines reliability and also how to demonstrate it. I've broken it down into 5 sections, starting with design, simulation, test, control and risk analysis. I will be rattling through them, apologies for that, but the video will be available afterwards and the presentation as well for referring back. So think about design. I think it is true to say that 5 nines reliability needs to be taken into consideration from the very beginning of the design development process, from design inputs planning and onwards. That's fine if you're designing a new device. If you've got a device you've already developed that you need to apply that to, then obviously this is more difficult, but really thinking about the need for this reliability from the word go if you can. In the design inputs and planning phase, a lot of that is about user requirements, make sure they're based on intended use and use tasks, really thinking about conditions of use, environments of use, and the user characteristics. Who's the device for, and just as importantly, who isn't it for? Thinking about the product requirements more generally, if you have a choice, don't over-constrain. Again, it's this kind of good basic principles, but I think there is a tendency sometimes to go for what you want rather than what you need. So really think about the size you have to achieve, the cost, and think about any additional functionality that you might be trying to build in, such as platform capability. Only go for these things if you really need them. and generate plans which are realistic and achievable. There is going to be extra work to do, potentially a lot of extra work to do in this development, so try and come up with timescales, resources, and think about the collaborations that you're going to need to put in place. In the concept generation, proof of principle phases, again, this is a good idea generally, but select concepts with reliability in mind and minimizing risk. So that's thinking about ease of use, performance robustness, ease of manufacture and assembly, thinking about that right at the beginning, and basing your solutions on established principles and technologies. For the proof of principle, proof of feasibility phase, you really want to try and build strong early understanding of the core operating principles of the device technology, identify the critical to quality attributes, sensitivities to them, think about the design envelope, the space and its limits, and use a combination of analytical and empirical methods, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. There's so much to say about the detailed design phase. I've homed in on a couple of things to perhaps bear in mind. In particular, one is working closely with manufacturing partners. So again, focus on being able to manufacture your device reliably. Think about process capabilities, targeting, if you can, CPKs of 2 at least. That's going to give you the kind of yield that you're going to need. And also in the analytical tools that you use statistical processes. So for example, tolerance stacks, look for a design intent capability again of CPK of 2. If you're doing Monte Carlo simulations, try and set acceptance limits at equal or less than 1 part per million. If you find you need to modify the design to achieve these, then do that. Compromise on these as rarely as possible. At this early stage is the best time you have to tune the design to get something that's going to meet the requirements. And again, one way of reducing variability might be in the way that you tolerance the part. So think about geometric dimension intolerancing as one option. Just a few things to think about there. We'll talk about simulation now. Overall benefits. So we talk about things like mathematical modeling, FEA, CFD, particularly helpful for 5.9s, and it allows building of a reliability model quite well in advance of having either any manufacturing data or test data available. And it's also a good way to support design optimization and informing key decisions. So a bit more on each of those tools now. Mathematical modeling. You can set up quite simple and then subsequently more advanced models of essential performance requirements such as injection time, activation force, and once you've done that, you can look at sensitivity analysis to confirm critical to function features and identify how they might impact performance. So you can look at the variability and overall reliability maybe through a Monte Carlo analysis like this, so predicting how many parts per million might be below a certain performance limit based on theoretical dimensions and other parameters that you put in. For FEA and CFD, we talk about things like stress analysis to look at component integrity, force deflection modeling as part of design optimization maybe, creep modeling, fatigue analysis, really looking at long-term effects before you've even got parts in your hand, and also for injection systems, potentially fluid mechanics or looking at thermal effects. Again, the overall benefits of this is you can maybe analyze system complexities that aren't straightforward to math model in first or second order models, and you can also provide data points to help support the validation of any bespoke models or simulation tools. Talking model validation, you are going to need to verify these models as part of evidence for reliability calculations. You won't be able to do that straight away, but you can build confidence in simulation as test data becomes available from rigs, from prototypes, from pilot devices, and then plan out how you're going to validate these models. Guidance on that topic is available from a number of sources. There is an ASME V&V guidance that's referenced there. Okay, rattling on. Section 3 is about testing. I've split it into 3 kinds of testing: that done during development, that done during verification, and then production testing. What kind of things are we talking about in development? It's like very early prototype fit and function testing, which is to build confidence in your chosen concept to make sure you're going down a good path early on. Then moving on to, say, design of experiment or Taguchi tests to build understanding, to really characterize design performance so you know what's important. Overstress testing, don't just test to the limits you've set yourself, test beyond that, identify weaknesses, improve robustness generally. Again, it's about giving yourself some headroom. Perhaps doing some testing on design extremes, so maximum minimum size components to check specific edges, corners of the design space. It's not really practical to do that across the board, but there may be key areas of extreme geometries that you want to look into. And then as soon as you can, get capability assessments on devices manufactured from tooled parts, perhaps rapid tools. That's to try and get this indication of capability early on that's more representative of molded product and product manufactured and assembled and put together in higher quantities to get a bit more illustration of the kind of variation that you might be seeing. It's all early days, but it's all going to help you establish a picture of whether you're close to what you are going to need to achieve. A word about human factors engineering in the testing section, really kind of early stage formative studies. It's central to medical device development. I think one key area it can support here is optimizing the design, identifying flaws and helping design them out. This is things about the design that might make them difficult to use, not intuitive to use, not effective to use. And the HFE generates this narrative showing how you've done that and how you've optimized the design. It also helps you think about the inclusive design, who is the device for or who isn't it for, and more these days, as well as use of human factors engineering and usability testing to inform requirements such as grip force. How have you demonstrated that your specification for grip force is appropriate? That needs quite careful consideration, and it's a bit too big a topic to enter detail here. For verification testing, so you'll be doing this all the time. It's a bit different for 5.9's devices. You do obviously need to do all the full conditioning and preconditioning, including storage, drop, vibration, etc. And the guidance does point towards some of these conditioning requirements being a bit tighter or more stringent than, say, in 11608. It also recommends specifically that any accelerated aging methods do require validation, which is something important to think about. You're obviously carrying out this testing on pretty much fully representative parts from maybe qualified tools, if not validated tools, and all the test methods, equipment, etc. will be validated as well at this point. You need to be thinking about appropriate test quantities based where you can on assessing variable data, not attribute testing. That brings numbers closer to what's achievable. Even so, the samples to demonstrate 5.9's at 95% are high, hundreds and above at least. And certainly for attribute testing, it's much higher than that. If you're doing specific reliability studies, you can work out or think about sample sizes based on means and variability that you're getting from these kind of tests. You can tell by the way I'm talking about it, probably I'm not a statistician. You are going to need good stats input to support the engineering and the development at this stage, if not before. And production testing again, so a couple of approaches generally used across the industry, sample-based testing to these ISO or ANSI approaches. For many products this is viable, but for 5.9's reliability it becomes impractical. I think really it's fair to say very high numbers required for demonstrating zero defect up into the hundreds of thousands. That's a huge amount of time and resource needed, and of course if at zero defect levels a single failure can lead to rejection of a whole batch. So statistical approach is much better using tolerance interval analysis. Again though, at these kind of reliability requirements, the K factor versus N curve is more demanding than say 97.5% at 95, which is 11608. So you are going to need more samples than you normally will. You're going to need statisticians as well, maybe more, maybe fewer, but you'll certainly need them. A few quick words on control, manufacturing process controls. The quote there from FDA, manufacturing controls must be adequate to produce reliable emergency use injectors. I think that's standard design transfer practice, but really demonstrating control of your CQAs, including features identified through design development, such as risk analysis. The guidance talks about proving capability for individual components and individual features, you're unlikely to be able to generate capability data for all of those dimensions, say in your tolerance analysis. So you're going to have to agree a strategy with your CMO on how you can get the appropriate evidence to demonstrate that your design is capable of being manufactured. 100% inline checks can be useful as evidence of this in terms of process control for use in the reliability report. Reliability only really starts when devices are in the hands of in the users. So post-launch, what controls have you got in place? What were that were implemented during design transfer? You need to constantly review them. If you do end up with CAPAs, CAPA activities perhaps arising from post-market surveillance, ensure you've got all sources of quality data feeding into that. And if you are needing to make any changes, make sure you refer back to the device understanding that you built during the development to make sure the changes you make are in line with what was learned during that development. So finally, section 5, risk analysis. Carried out in line with ISO 14971 throughout the development. A range of tools and techniques. Fault tree analysis is in there, it always has been, but also other things, use-related risk assessment, software risk analysis, and then various FMEAs and FMECAs. It's interesting, this is one point of debate. I think 14971 talks about performance required and level of risk being based on potential harm to the user. And that's not necessarily fully in line with a universal 5 nines reliability for all EPRs. So there's some discussion around that. But as the guidance says, any risk analysis used to support the FDA should be included in the reliability report, and it's an important part of it. So the fault tree analysis, it is a well-established tool. There's a standard dictating, outlining how it can be applied. Probability-based failure rates. It's been used in other industries, typically more so than perhaps medical device development until now. It's a top-down approach. And this is trying to illustrate, so the main faults right at the top, failure to successfully inject, feeding down through a number of different failure modes, failed trigger mechanism, failed needle guard, etc., basic events, and then root causes. The guidance gets into quite a bit of detail, talks about each basic event being assessed through cumulative analysis, the probability data for each event supported with evidence, even getting down, as I mentioned, to use a statistical tolerance interval method. Limits for each individual component are analysed. So that's dimensions, geometry, material strength, etc., both by itself and in conjunction with other components up through sub-assemblies, referencing things like tolerance stack analysis. And it also clearly states the basic event is a failure mode event or state that can't be further developed. So taking into all together, those bits of guidance really do point towards a very, very detailed fault tree analysis. And I think one of the challenges is, what does that actually mean in practice? How far down do you need to go, and how do you generate all of this evidence that you need? Possible approaches, I think the first thing is really think about where the fault tree analysis resides in your technical file and reflect this in the planning. Is it part of risk management? Is it part of analysis, V&V? Get that initial FTA developed quite early on to help your development as part of perhaps as part of a system risk analysis. If you're applying predicted probability, and looking at that from point of view of simulation, design analysis, that's really giving you an initial picture on how close you're going to be to where you need. And if the analysis is predicting challenges, then you better go and address those. Also a good time at this point to be double checking user requirements and product requirements. And then as you get more and more data available, either from refined simulations, such as tolerance analysis, maybe test results from tooled parts, and then production data, you can refine the FTA and the numbers inside it, and then reflect verification test results and manufacturing data from process validation to support that reliability report. I think it's fair to say we've certainly seen different approaches being taken to use of the fault tree, and just highly recommend discussing that with FDA in advance to make sure that your approach is going to be acceptable. One of the areas I think of uncertainty is how do you combine the different kinds of data you're going to get. So for predicting reliability, you might have data from production testing, release testing, DV testing. You'll have manufacturing data, so empirical data, measurement data, and also analytical data, predictions from your simulations, from your tools, and they're not all the same kind of information or data. So how do you combine them? How do you effectively have a kind of hierarchy? This is just one suggestion, perhaps, to at the top, really the high level performance is to base it on empirical data, physical evidence. What are you getting in test results in either DV or production release testing? And then as you come down through that, support that with manufacturing data and analytical data, and then right down at the kind of the more root causes and basic events, so perhaps manufacturing data and the analysis from tolerance analysis or simulations, which is giving the evidence for performance. So you need to decide whether you're going to use analytical data and empirical data, analyzing and testing, or are you focusing the testing in key areas, either maybe where you can't analyze or where it's absolutely critical to demonstrate performance, such as at the high level performance requirements. So I'm going to rattle through a few draft questions now around the guidance. So one is, where does the FTA sit relative to other elements, whether that's part of the risk management plan, and how does it fit in with your other risk analysis tools such as Mika, or is it actually part of an engineering analysis tool? It can be seen as an analytical and predictive tool, so maybe it sits there. And also it's got to be part of your final reliability report. So think in advance where you're going to position it and how you're going to dovetail it in with other parts of the technical file. What about 4 nines? Early on in correspondence, there was reference to 4 nines, 99.99% reliability for some of the essential performance requirements, but in the published guidance that's not mentioned, and the assumption really is that everything effectively needs to be viewed as important in order to achieve a successful injection. So things like injection force or safety removal or delivered dose, etc. So do they all need to be at 5 nines? If so, how feasible is that? I think that's one outstanding question. The role of human factors in proving this level of reliability is a big topic of debate. I think the quantitative versus qualitative nature of human factors work has always been a topic since guidance first released back in 2000. But how can you use HF to establish the reliability of a user being able, for example, to hold an injector for 10 seconds, not just to be able to do it, but also to understand that they need to be able to do it. And I think the extent to which HFE can be applied statistically is an ongoing topic. Came across this quote, which I like, from Ron Kay, who's ex-FDA CDRH. If you think you can apply statistics to this stuff, then not only you don't understand the process, you don't understand statistical theory either. So it is an area of much debate, and that it will be ongoing for a while, I suspect. A couple of other things to think about. So life cycle management, as I said, reliability doesn't end at the point of submission. That's really when it starts, when devices are put into the hands of users. So I'm really thinking about maintaining reliability through the life cycle, as part of manufacturing, as part of post-market surveillance, as part of implementing changes, modifications through life cycle, and constantly referring back to reliability and the need for it. So that's a big race through the topic. In summary, the guidance has brought some clarity, I think that's fair to say, as to what FDA are expecting from these kind of products, and it describes application of well-established tools as part of traditional development activities and approaches. The required level of reliability is high, and that's understandable given the nature of the product, but it may be challenging, depending on the product, to achieve and also to demonstrate. And I'd certainly think fair to say that some aspects of the guidance and how it should be applied are unclear. So here's a list of some of the outstanding questions that I've mentioned through the paper, and also there's a reference there to the FDA website, which has got comment from various industry bodies and companies with their comments on the guidance, which are quite informative to read. I think some of the questions arise, such as does this guidance push manufacturers towards maybe excluding some populations from target user groups, for example, from the point of view of requirements? Will some manufacturers shy away altogether from bringing these kind of products to the market, or from trying to improve existing approved devices? There's a bit of a theme around, is the guidance truly consistent with ISO 14971? For example, having a flat failure rate rather than basing it on specific risk of harm to the user. And also there's a question in there, is there any scope for reducing that requirement? Even a small change to 99.995 at 95% would make a big difference, for example, on sample sizes for testing. And finally, what changes, if any, might be made before the guidance is no longer draft? So thank you very much for listening. Apologies again for rushing through that. I'm sure the slides will be made available for future reference, but we've still got a little bit of time for any questions.
So yes, as Chris mentioned, we've now got some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions about the presentation, please do submit those via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Just to start us off though, we did have one come in while you're presenting, Chris. They've asked, how can you be sure that a change in raw material that's used in a device is not possible or fixed to minimize risk?
Yep, thanks for that question. My understanding is if you're using medical grade materials, one of the benefits of that is that there are constraints on what can be changed and what can't, and you need to be fully informed about the changes. So although they might be the same as other materials that don't have medical grade, going for the medical grade version requires suppliers to inform you of that. If you do have a material change, then you do need to look at a full risk assessment of that. There's a standard out there on change assessment and the process that you need to go through, but it's true to say that can certainly be the kind of thing that will affect performance that you may or may not be aware of.
Brilliant. Okay, I hope that answered your question. So we've got another one that's come in fast. How much does the need to actually achieve 5 nines add to your overall device development program?
Yeah, it depends. Depends on a few things, including, I think, how capable your device is. If you've got a device that is capable and it's really about demonstrating that, I think there's certain extra tasks that you need to do. Some things you'll be doing anyway, but maybe need to go to a higher level of detail, such as the analysis, such as I think the fault tree analysis itself, although you might have used it generally in the past, that's probably a new way of using it. That's going to take some extra time. I think the testing programs can be an extensive kind of extra load, and the I think design transfer activities. So there's a lot of it is the same. It's the same process, apart from perhaps the use of fault tree in this way and the reliability report. But it's going at the extra mile, and then if you have challenges with the device that need to resolve, that can take more time. I would say at least plan for another, I don't know, 30%, I don't know, very approximately. It could be more than that. It does depend on the device, but it certainly you need to sit down and think about it.
Excellent. So we've just had another question in. They've asked on the relationship with 5 nines and ISO 14971, is the assumption that the 5 nines applies to the P1 score?
By P1, take that to meaning that the highest priority, the highest risk, and I think that's it's a good point. So, for example, certainly, if you were looking, maybe not thinking in terms of 5 nines, you would look at potential failure modes such as not delivering the drug at all. That's going to be the highest risk. That's going to be perhaps that P1. You do need that. But if it's whether you're achieving needle extended length quite right, or full delivered dose quite right, and how far out are you from that, I think that's where, if you're doing a traditional risk analysis, you might have a lower severity of that, and therefore probably a lower required performance or reliability on that. And I think that's maybe where this kind of people are picking up on this discrepancy rather than a blanket 5 nines against all. Because at the end of the day, if you're trying to sum up these probabilities of these 4 nines, if you've got any 4 nines in there and add them up, they're going to come to, then you're not going to achieve the 5 nines. So I think that's where the kind of some of the debate in industry is lying. How is this consistent with 14971? Is it fully consistent? And if not, how do you handle that?